Picture a stretch of grey mud on the edge of England, a shallow tidal creek, a cluster of fishermen's cottages huddled against the wind, 7 crooked streets, and a few hundred souls who go to bed hungry more often than not. In the year 1571, the people of this place wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth I, and in it they described their own home. They called it, in their own words, Her Majesty's poor decayed town of Liverpool. Poor, decayed, that was Liverpool. Now hold that image in your mind, because within just a few generations, this poor decayed town would do something that should have been impossible. It would tear the world's first great commercial dock straight out of that mud. It would seize control of global shipping and build a monstrous fortune on the darkest trade in human history. It would raise a waterfront so vast and so grand that visitors said it looked less like a British town and more like New York. And it would become known across the largest empire the world had ever seen as the second city of the empire, second only to London itself. This is the story of how a place that almost nobody wanted willed itself into global domination. And it is also the story of how that same city, sitting at the very top of the world, came crashing down harder and faster than almost any city in modern British history. This is the most impossible rise of a city ever, and this is how it ended. To understand how strange Liverpool's rise really is, you have to understand that for most of its history, Liverpool barely existed at all. The town was born on the 28th of August in the year 1207, when King John granted it a royal charter. He did not do this out of love. He wanted a port he could use to ship soldiers across to Ireland, a port that was not controlled by the powerful Earl of Chester. So his men laid out 7 simple streets in the shape of the letter H, threw up a castle on the hill, and declared the borough of Liverpool open for business. Almost nothing happened. For 400 years, almost nothing happened at all. By the middle of the 1500s, the population had actually shrunk to around 600 people. In the year 1600, there were barely 2,000. As late as 1699, Liverpool held only around 5,000 people, clinging to a muddy pool by the sea, and the reason was simple. Just down the coast sat a giant. The city of Chester on the River Dee had been the great port of the northwest of England since Roman times. Ships came to Chester from Spain, from Ireland, from Germany, laden with wine and cloth. Chester was rich, respectable, and ancient. Liverpool, by comparison, was nothing. In 1569, an official survey found that Liverpool could muster a fleet of just 12 small ships, and when King Charles I demanded a special tax from his ports, Chester was ordered to pay £100, while tiny Liverpool was assessed at just 15. Liverpool was so insignificant that legally it was not even its own port. It was classed as a mere creek belonging to the port of Chester, the little brother, the afterthought. And then the river turned. For centuries, the River Dee had been slowly choking to death on its own silt. Mud and sand crept in from the sea year after year, filling the channel, stranding the ships, pushing the harbour further and further from the great city that depended on it. Merchants had to unload further and further downstream, and nothing they built could stop it. By the 1800s, Chester's river was effectively dead, unable to carry the great ocean-going vessels of the modern age. But the river Mersey, on which Liverpool sat, did not silt up. It ran deep. It had one of the highest tidal ranges in all of Britain, a colossal rise and fall of the water that could reach as high as 10 metres between low tide and high. That enormous tide was violent and dangerous and difficult, but it also meant deep water, and deep water meant that the largest ships in the world could come to Liverpool when they no longer could come to Chester. The river had chosen. And the strange, unglamorous truth at the heart of Liverpool's rise is this: Liverpool did not outfight Chester. Liverpool simply outlasted it. It won by being the port the sea did not abandon. But a deep river is only an opportunity. What Liverpool did next is what turned opportunity into an empire. That violent tide was a problem. When the water dropped 10 metres, any ship tied up at the quay was left stranded, tipped over on its side in the mud, unable to load or unload for hours. It was chaos. It was slow. And a group of Liverpool merchants and councillors decided to do something that had never successfully been done anywhere in the world before. They decided to build a wall around the water. The idea was an enclosed dock, a basin sealed off from the river by gates, so that the water inside stayed high and calm no matter what the tide outside was doing. Ships could float there and be worked around the clock. In the year 1708, the town won an Act of Parliament to build it, and they hired an engineer named Thomas Steers, one of the finest canal men in the country, to make it real. What Steers did was extraordinary. He took the very pool that had given the town its name, the muddy tidal creek, and he transformed it. His men dug it out, lined it with brick laid straight onto the bedrock, and fitted it with a gate that could hold back the sea. On the 31st of August in the year 1715, the old dock opened. It was the first commercial enclosed wet dock in the world. Ships could now be loaded and emptied regardless of the tide, faster than in any rival port on earth. But make no mistake, this was a colossal gamble. The dock cost around £12,000, double the original estimate. And it was the town corporation itself that had borrowed the money and stood behind the debt. If the dock had failed, Liverpool could have been ruined. The whole town bet its future on a hole in the mud, and the bet paid off beyond anyone's dreams. As the National Museums of Liverpool put it, the impact was immense, and London, Bristol and Chester all lost significant trade over the following century as a direct result. Liverpool had built the future, and now it needed something to fill those ships. It found it, and here the story turns very dark. The trade that made Liverpool rich was the transatlantic slave trade. It worked in a triangle. Liverpool ships sailed south to the coast of West Africa, loaded with goods, cotton cloth woven in Manchester, guns and iron forged in Birmingham. On the African coast, those goods were exchanged for human beings. The captured men, women and children were chained below decks and carried across the Atlantic on the horror of the Middle Passage, mostly to the plantations of the West Indies, and the ships returned to Liverpool loaded with the produce of enslaved labour, sugar, rum, tobacco and raw cotton. Liverpool's first known slave ship, the Liverpool Merchant, sailed in October of the year 1699 and delivered 220 captive Africans to Barbados. It was only the beginning. Liverpool threw itself into the trade with a ferocity that overtook London and Bristol within decades. By the years between 1793 and 1807, Liverpool ships were responsible for a staggering 84.7% of all British slaving voyages. Across the whole grim history of the trade, Liverpool vessels carried well over 1 million enslaved Africans across the ocean. By one estimate, more than 1 in every 6 Africans transported in the entire British slave trade travelled on a Liverpool ship. This was not a shameful secret hidden at the edge of town. This was the town. The slave merchants were the men who ran Liverpool. In the year 1787, 37 of the town council's 41 members were connected to the trade. Every single mayor of Liverpool between 1787 and 1807 was a slave trader. Consider the men who built the city. Foster Cunliffe was 3 times mayor of Liverpool and a patron of its charity school and its infirmary, and he and his sons owned slave ships that carried more than 1,000 captives. William Gregson rose from being a humble rope maker to mayor of Liverpool on the back of at least 152 slaving voyages, which carried over 58,000 Africans, of whom more than 9,000 died. Thomas Leyland, another 3-time mayor, ran voyages that delivered over 22,000 enslaved people, then turned that blood money into a respectable Liverpool bank. And perhaps the most consequential of all was John Gladstone, who owned more than 2,500 enslaved people on his plantations in Jamaica and Demerara. When Britain finally abolished slavery and paid compensation, not to the enslaved, but to the enslavers, John Gladstone received the single largest payout of anyone in the entire British Empire, £106,769. His son, William Ewart Gladstone, born in the year 1809 at number 62 Rodney Street in Liverpool, would go on to become one of Britain's greatest prime ministers, and in his very first speeches in Parliament he defended his family's plantations. The cruelty of the trade had no bottom. In the year 1781, a Liverpool-owned ship called the Zong, its captain lost and its water supplies failing, threw more than 130 living chained Africans overboard into the sea to drown. Why? Because the enslaved people were insured as cargo, and the owners calculated that they could claim more money for slaves lost at sea than for slaves who died of thirst on board. When the insurers refused to pay, the Liverpool owners took them to court, not for murder, but to collect the insurance. The judge, Lord Mansfield, remarked that the case was being treated as though it were simply horses that had been thrown overboard. The Zong massacre, exposed by the formerly enslaved writer Olaudah Equiano and the campaigner Granville Sharp, would help ignite the movement to end the trade forever. But Liverpool did not want it to end. When abolition was debated, the town council formally protested to Parliament, insisting the trade had been carried on, with advantages to the country, both important and extensive. To stand against slavery in Liverpool was genuinely dangerous, yet a brave few did. There was William Roscoe, the poet, historian and lawyer, often called Liverpool's greatest citizen, who was elected a Member of Parliament and voted for abolition, and who was physically attacked by furious slave traders in the street when he came home. And there was Edward Rushton, the blind poet, who had lost his sight after catching a disease while trying to smuggle food and water to the dying captives on a slave ship, and who founded a school for the blind that still operates today. In the year 1807, the slave trade was abolished, and Liverpool, a city built on that trade, faced a choice: collapse or reinvent itself. It reinvented itself, and it was about to reach heights that would have been unimaginable to those fishermen in their poor, decayed town. The 19th century belonged to Liverpool. The engine of the new age was cotton, grown on the plantations of the American South, shipped into Liverpool by the millions of bales, and fed into the roaring mills of Manchester and Lancashire. Liverpool became the greatest cotton market on the face of the earth, and in the year 1830, the two cities were joined by another world first, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the first true intercity railway anywhere, opened with George Stephenson's famous locomotive, the Rocket, thundering down the line. To handle this explosion of trade, Liverpool needed docks on a scale never before imagined, and it found the man to build them. His name was Jesse Hartley, the son of a Yorkshire stonemason, and for 36 years, from 1824 until his death in 1860, he was the dock engineer of Liverpool. In that time, he expanded the water area of the docks from 46 acres to over 200, and he built with a grandeur that still stands today. His masterpiece was the Albert Dock, opened by Prince Albert himself in the year 1846, the first great fireproof warehouse system in the world, built entirely of iron, brick and stone, with no structural timber to burn. Standing before it, Prince Albert said, "I have heard of the greatness of Liverpool, but the reality far surpasses my expectation. Through those docks flowed not just goods, but people, millions of them. Liverpool became the great gateway of European emigration to America, and it also became a refuge in a catastrophe." When the Irish famine struck, the starving poured across the sea into Liverpool. In just the first 3 months of the year 1846, over 90,000 Irish arrived. In 1847 alone, nearly 300,000 came. By 1851, a quarter of everyone in Liverpool had been born in Ireland. The city's character was changed forever, and with the money came the buildings. Liverpool raised a waterfront to rival any city on earth. At the pier head rose the Three Graces, the Royal Liver Building, crowned with its 2 mythical liver birds, completed in the year 1911, the Cunard Building and the Port of Liverpool Building. Behind them stood St George's Hall, one of the finest neoclassical buildings in all of Europe, and on Water Street stood Oriel Chambers, built in 1864, an iron-framed office block with walls of glass that was a direct ancestor of the modern skyscraper. Little wonder that in the year 1886, the Illustrated London News called Liverpool the New York of Europe, a world city rather than merely British provincial. Liverpool was the beating heart of global shipping. The Cunard Line ran its great mail steamers from here. The White Star Line built its headquarters here at number 30 James Street. And when the White Star Line launched the most famous ship in history, the Titanic, it was Liverpool that was named as her home port. The word Liverpool was painted across her stern, even as she sank into the North Atlantic in April of the year 1912. By the year 1931, the population of Liverpool had reached its all-time peak, 846,302 people, from 600 souls in a decayed town to a city of nearly 1 million, the second city of the empire. The impossible rise was complete, and then it all began to fall apart. The first blow came from the sky. In the Second World War, Liverpool and its docks were the single most important lifeline in Britain, the great port through which the convoys brought food, fuel and weapons across the Atlantic. And so the enemy came for it. Between the 1st and the 7th of May, in the year 1941, the city endured the May Blitz, the most concentrated bombing of any British city outside London. Over 7 nights, hundreds of German bombers dropped more than 2,300 high-explosive bombs on Liverpool. On the night of the 3rd of May, a ship named the Militant, loaded with around 1,000 tons of bombs, caught fire in the Huskisson dock. When it finally exploded, the blast was so enormous that pieces of the ship's hull were hurled over 1 mile through the air, and a 2-ton anchor was later found beside a hospital in Bootle. Across Merseyside, more than 4,000 civilians were killed, 10,000 homes destroyed, and 70,000 people left homeless. When Winston Churchill visited the shattered city, he said, "I see the damage done by the enemy attacks, but I also see the spirit of an unconquered people." But the docks that had won the war would not survive the peace, because after the war, the entire logic of Liverpool's existence began to collapse. Britain's trade turned away from the Atlantic and toward Europe, and that left Liverpool sitting on the wrong side of the country, facing an ocean that no longer mattered as much. And then came the killer. Not the bomb, but a box, the shipping container. From the 1960s, world shipping was transformed by the standardized steel container, a simple metal box that could be lifted straight from ship to truck to train by a single crane with almost no human labor. It was faster and cheaper than anything before it, but it needed deep water, huge open spaces, and modern crane-worked quays. Liverpool's old finger docks, dug out by hand and crowded with warehouses, were hopelessly wrong for it. The trade flowed instead to new ports, Tilbury, Felixstowe, Southampton, and the men of the docks were simply no longer needed. Where Liverpool had employed around 12,000 dockers in the 1960s, that had fallen to 6,000 by 1980. Then in the year 1989, the government abolished the National Dock Labour Scheme, the system that had guaranteed dockers their jobs. Within a few years, the directly employed workforce collapsed from around 1,100 men to just 500. A trade that had employed generations of Liverpool families was vanishing before their eyes. The dockers made one last stand, and it became legendary. In September of the year 1995, a small firm on the docks sacked 5 men in a row over overtime pay. When their workmates picketed in protest, all 80 of them were dismissed. And then around 500 dockers of the main dock company refused to cross that picket line, so the company sacked them too, declaring that the men had in effect dismissed themselves. Some of those dockers received their dismissal letters delivered to the dock gates by a fleet of taxis. What followed was one of the most remarkable labour disputes in modern history. The sacked Liverpool dockers, led by shop stewards like Mike Carden, Bobby Morton and Tony Nelson, refused to give up for 28 months. And extraordinarily, they took their fight global, using the early internet to reach dock workers around the world. In September of the year 1997, dockers in some 16 countries took action in solidarity with Liverpool. The footballer Robbie Fowler wore a t-shirt supporting them on the pitch. The veteran politician Tony Benn declared that the dispute would be remembered on the same scale and with the same honour as the Tolpuddle Martyrs and the Great Miners' Strike. But solidarity could not defeat the law and the economics. In January of the year 1998, the exhausted dockers finally voted to accept a severance settlement of £28,000 each. The great port of Liverpool, which had lifted the town from the mud, had let go of its workers for the last time. And the docks were not the only thing dying. Across Merseyside, the factories were closing one after another. In the year 1978, the car plant at Speke, which built the Triumph sports car, shut its gates, throwing around 3,000 people out of work. In November of the year 1979, the world-famous Meccano and Dinky Toys factory on Binns Road, the place that had made toys for British children for 3/4 of a century, was closed by its owners, costing around 1,000 jobs. As the workers occupied the plant in desperation, the managing director, Ray McNeice, gave them a brutally simple explanation. "We have run out of money. It's as simple as that." Then in the year 1981, the Tate and Lyle sugar refinery on Love Lane closed, ending around 1,800 jobs, and it did so in the same period that its parent company announced that its profits had risen by £4.5 million to over 30 million. To the people of Liverpool, the message could not have been clearer. The city was being discarded. The numbers tell a story of collapse almost without parallel. Unemployment in Liverpool reached around 17% by early 1982, and would climb above 20%. An average of 12,000 people were leaving the city every single year. Whole districts stood derelict. Nearly 15% of the land in the city lay vacant or abandoned. The population, which had peaked at 846,000 in 1931, would eventually fall to just 439,000 by the year 2001, a loss of nearly half the entire city. And then, in the summer of the year 1981, all of that despair exploded into fire. It began on the 3rd of July, in the Toxteth district, with the arrest of a young black man named Leroy Cooper, amid years of anger over unemployment and aggressive police stop and search. In Toxteth, male unemployment had reached 31%. The arrest sparked 9 days of the worst rioting mainland Britain had seen in living memory. Around 468 police officers were injured. Roughly 500 people were arrested. More than 70 buildings were so badly burned that they had to be demolished. In the early hours of the 6th of July, the Merseyside police did something that had never been done before on the British mainland. They fired CS gas at the crowds. And on the 28th of July, a disabled man named David Moore, aged just 23, was struck and killed by a police vehicle clearing the streets. The riots forced the government in London to confront the state of Liverpool, and the confrontation exposed something shocking. The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, sent one of her most senior ministers, Michael Heseltine, to the city as, in effect, the Minister for Merseyside, and Heseltine argued passionately that the city must not be abandoned. But behind closed doors, another view was being put forward. In a confidential letter dated the 4th of September 1981, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Geoffrey Howe, wrote to the Prime Minister, warning her not to waste money trying to save the city. He asked whether propping up Liverpool was simply trying, in his words, to pump water uphill. And then he wrote a phrase that would haunt the city for decades. He suggested that the government should perhaps go instead for what he called managed decline. And then he added a chilling instruction: "This is not a term for use, even privately." That letter stayed secret for 30 years. When it was finally released to the public in December of the year 2011, it confirmed what many in Liverpool had long suspected, that at its lowest moment, their own government had privately debated whether to simply let the city die. Into this fury and betrayal stepped the most controversial chapter of all. In the year 1983, a group of far-left socialists, known as the Militant Tendency, took control of Liverpool City Council, with the sharp-suited deputy leader Derek Hatton as their public face. The militants decided to fight the government head-on. They set an illegal budget, refusing to make cuts, daring the government to stop them. But by 1985, the council was running out of money to pay its own staff. And in a move that stunned the country, the council issued redundancy notices to its entire workforce of 30,000 people. And just as would happen to the dockers a decade later, those notices were sent out around the city by a fleet of taxis. It was a step too far, even for the militants' own party. At the Labour Party conference on the 1st of October 1985, the party's leader, Neil Kinnock, turned on them in one of the most famous speeches in British political history. "I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises," he thundered. "You end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle round a city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers." As Kinnock spoke, a Liverpool Member of Parliament stormed off the platform in protest, and Derek Hatton shouted "lies" from the balcony. In the end, 47 of the militant councillors were surcharged, disqualified from office, and Hatton himself was expelled from the Labour Party. The Great Rebellion had failed, and Liverpool, exhausted and hollowed out, hit rock bottom. But this is not where the story ends, because Liverpool, the city that willed itself out of the mud, was not finished. Slowly, painfully, it began to climb again. That masterpiece of the docks, Jesse Hartley's Albert Dock, closed and rotting for years, was restored and reopened in the year 1988 and became home to art galleries and museums, including a museum dedicated to confronting the city's own slave trading past. In the year 2004, the United Nations recognised Liverpool's waterfront as a World Heritage Site, calling it the supreme example of a great commercial port at the height of Britain's global power. And in the year 2008, Liverpool was named the European Capital of Culture, drawing millions of visitors and bringing hundreds of millions of pounds back into the region. That same year, as builders dug the foundations for a vast new shopping district in the heart of the city, they uncovered something extraordinary buried beneath the modern streets. The old brick walls of Thomas Steer's original dock, the very first dock, the 300-year-old hole in the mud where the whole impossible story had begun. Today you can walk down beneath the shops and stand beside it on a street named, fittingly, Thomas Steer's Way. Liverpool's rise was built on a river that refused to die, on a gamble in the mud, on the genius of its engineers, and on the profits of one of the greatest crimes in human history. Its fall was written by bombs, by a steel box, by shuttered factories, and by a government that whispered the words "managed decline." But the people of that poor, decayed town never quite let go. Today, the population is growing once more, back above 500,000. The town that nobody wanted made itself the second city of the greatest empire on earth. It rose from nothing, touched the very top of the world, fell almost all the way back down, and refused, in the end, to disappear. That is the most impossible rise of a city ever. That is Liverpool.